Of course, this is day 14 of this trial now. The three former Minneapolis police officers are J. Alexander King, Thomas Lane, and Tou Thao. All three of them are accused of violating George Floyd's civil rights during his arrest on May 25th of 2020 when he tried to pass that counterfeit $20 bill inside the Cup food stores on the corner of 38th and Chicago. Of course, the fourth officer who was on the scene that day, Derek Chauvin has already pleaded guilty in this federal civil rights case, but he is also now in prison for 22 years, convicted in the death of George Floyd. Rob Olson has been in federal court for the entire length of this trial so far. He joins us now from St. Paul, where they are now in the middle of a lunch break. Rob, there are two headlines here essentially today. Number one is that the defense now takes over in this trial. The prosecution from the U.S. Attorney's Office wrapped up yesterday afternoon. And the second headline is that former officer Tou Thao takes the stand in his own defense. And what I find fascinating about this is, for the first time, not only are we hearing from him about what happened that day, but we're also learning more about his journey into becoming a Minneapolis police officer. And it's quite the journey, isn't it, Rob?
Yeah, and that's significant. Again, the first time that you're hearing Tou Thao publicly speak about any of what occurred here, anything to do related to this case. He was actually the second witness on the stand today. The first witness was an FBI agent who took part in the recorded interview of Tou Thao along with the BCA. His testimony was very brief, a matter of 10 minutes or so, just basically establishing that he took part in that interview and that there were other interviews done with witnesses that he did not take part in, and that he could say were not recorded, but he did not know why those were not recorded. We will see how that becomes potentially significant later on in the defense side of this case. Tou Thao then taking the stand. This is already before 10 o'clock. He's been up there then now for more than 2.5 hours, and I anticipate he'll be up there for much of the day, if not the entire day, because this is pretty lengthy testimony here. And he goes through his biographical details at the beginning. Pretty common for every witness to get up there, but certainly much more significant in this case for the jury to hear about his background. Is the St. Paul-born son of immigrants, refugees, among refugees. He said born in St. Paul. They lived in North Minneapolis for a time, but he testified too about how that at that time among kids, he said, were getting bullied, that it wasn't safe due to those fears. They moved to Fridley, which is where he graduated from high school, and testified about an incident in his life that had kind of had a lot of influence on his decision to become a police officer. He testified that his father was strict and abusive. He and his brother had gotten into a fight, and the punishment was that his father went and got an electrical cord and whipped them with an electrical cord. When his mother intervened, he then turned that abuse to his mother and then went and got a .22 caliber pistol and threatened to kill them. They fled to an aunt's house, called police, and he said that interaction with the officer that arrived to respond to their call were, he said two of the, I think he said happiest or most comfortable. He said here, the two most peaceful days of my childhood is how he describes that. His voice was cracking. He got emotional during that, and that influenced him. His decision then, to pursue a law enforcement career, and specifically in Minneapolis.
Now, the testimony then transitioned into his training at the academy, and his attorney, Robert Poley, seemed to show quite a few pictures and videos of the kind of training they were going through, and specifically to the use of the knee during an arrest.
Yeah, he showed, and I'd have to count. I mean, it was 15 to 20 pictures. I didn't count them all up, but they were quite a few pictures that go to a couple of things that were from his training with the Minneapolis Police Department in their academy. And this is in 08, 09. And a couple of things. Robert Poley is saying that the training, they're trying to establish that there's a paramilitary culture, which goes to the idea that they didn't want to counteract or Derek Chauvin's decision to hold George Floyd on the ground. So there was a number of pictures that showed them training, physical training, running information, singing cadences. They even put lyrics of one of the cadences up to show that this was a very militaristic kind of thing. Showed them then information doing other trainings like riot gear trainings with batons, etc. Again, going to that. And then a number of pictures of actual use of force training in which it shows a prone subject. And this is, somebody that is wearing protective gear because this is part of training. But they are prone. They are face down on the ground with two officers on top of them, two of the recruits going through the academy. Many of these pictures then do show the use of a knee. Sometimes it's on the upper back, sometimes it's on the lower neck. There were a couple that did show it looked like it was right on the neck, but typically it was kind of in that neck vicinity. So this goes to the idea that Minneapolis Police Department has said that they didn't train to use knees, and certainly not a knee on the neck. This, again, is the defense showing, here's all these pictures from your training, and they all show the use of knees, and very often either in the vicinity of the neck or really what appears to be right on kind of maybe the base of the neck.
Mm-hmm. And then Attorney Pauly, transitions to the scene that day. We're talking about May 25th of 2020 in the corner of 38th and Chicago, and we now start to see again the body camera video from Tou Thao. And we've seen this video, the jury has already seen this video, but for the first time we actually get to hear Tou Thao's interpretation of what's on that video. Walk us through that, Rob.
Yeah, he said he and Derek Chauvin, who were partnered that day, and he'd been partnered with Derek Chauvin, not every day. I mean, they would rotate, but had worked with him quite a bit. And they were at the 3rd Precinct getting ready to eat dinner when they got the call to respond to backup at 38th in Chicago. While they were en route there, the dispatcher canceled them because of various things. I think EMS was called, but dispatch had canceled them. So Robert Pauly asked him, well, why did you could have just turned around and gone back to the precinct and gone back to the dinner you were about to eat. Why did you continue? And he said because in his experience, that neighborhood was a known gang area, and that it was a potentially dangerous area, and he was worried that Lane and King, being just a few days out onto the streets after their field training, may not have been aware of that. So they said that was their reason for continuing to respond, despite the fact that dispatch told them they'd been canceled.
And what I also found fascinating was his testimony today that once they tried to place George Floyd under arrest, as to the struggle that took place. He said in all of his years as a police officer, he'd never seen that kind of struggle. And that seemed to open up the testimony into what he observed, and in the entire testimony on excited delirium that has really been central to this case so far.
Yeah, and that's part of the defense, too. That's another thing that they're making a case for. You heard it a lot in their cross-examination where they would go into the excited delirium training here. That was a significant part of testimony in the prosecution side about excited delirium training, because the defense is really making the case and is going to argue and is arguing that excited delirium was very much a top-of-mind thing for these officers who are responding because they'd heavily trained on it. So Tou Thao, as you see him, and they're playing, portions of his body-worn camera that begins as he's behind the wheel of the squad that he and Chauvin were in. They play a little bit, and then he'll kind of talk about that situation. So they're walking up to the squad car that Lane and King are in the process of trying to detain George Floyd in the backseat of that squad car. And that's when he mentions that this, in his 8 years of experience at that time, he'd never seen a struggle like that. And then immediately kind of goes into the testimony about how he suspected that this was a case of excited delirium. Robert Pauly asks, why did you believe that? And he said, well, you see the beads of sweat on his forehead. Now, this is late May. It was 75 degrees, and there's been a struggle here. So, beads of sweat, you would say, well, of course that's going to happen. But he said that in his mind, that was one of the symptoms of excited delirium, along with being incoherent, he said, and being not responding to their commands, and being difficult to control. And superhuman strength is one of the attributes attributed to the excited delirium symptoms. And he said here was somebody who was basically stronger than 3 officers who were trying to get him in this car. Now, initially, of course, it was the 2 trying to get him in, and then Derek Chauvin joins in there at the tail end of it. But he said that, yes, here is somebody who basically is, you've got 3 officers that are working on this, and he said he'd never seen that much of a struggle in his 8 years.
And what's interesting about this and why this whole concept is so controversial is because medical organizations such as the American Medical Association don't officially recognize the term excited delirium.
Yeah, they don't recognize it as a diagnosis.
Right.
We've had testimony, in this trial that from the emergency room physician that was at Hennepin County Medical Center that night, who's not there now, but when he came back, and he said that he recognizes it as a condition of people that he sees, but recognizing it's a controversial term, and that the AMA and others don't recognize it as a diagnosis because it is, controversial. They think that too often it is used as sort of a catch-all, potentially scapegoat term for in-custody deaths. That then it's blamed on this when there are other factors, and so that's why it becomes debated about, well, we can't just automatically assign this to why this person died in custody when there are other factors at play here, which of course is an issue in this case as well. But this is very much part of the defense's strategy and case here for the jury, is that they were trained on excited delirium, and all the signs pointed in Tou Thao's mind that is exactly what they were dealing with here, and that the standard procedure then, he said, we were going through our excited delirium protocols, which is to restrain somebody and hold them until EMS arrives, at which point then they can be sedated.
And they knew EMS, according to his testimony today, was scheduled to arrive at any moment.
They knew it was on the way, and so they thought it might be there in a matter of minutes. Of course, as the history shows here through the body camera videos and the other videos, it would be more than a few minutes until they got there. It was 9-10 minutes, I guess, depending on where you're starting the clock of what time they were called. But he said that's why he suggested getting what's called a hobble restraint, or sometimes called a hog tie, out of the squad, in which an ankle and the wrists are sort of tied together to restrain somebody, and then at that point they can put them on their side. He started getting that out when they made the decision to not do so because they knew that the ambulance was on its way. So he said in his testimony, they decided not to tie him up with this restraint device because then it would just be more for the paramedics to undo when they got there in order to give medical attention to George Floyd. So again, in his mind, he said they thought this was just a matter of a few minutes. So at this point, they didn't want to restrain him that way.
And Rob, right before lunch break here, testimony regarding the off-duty firefighter who was on the scene that day. She testified at George Floyd's trial, Derek Chauvin's trial, I should say, and about trying to intervene there, and she, you could clearly hear her on the videotapes saying, "Have you checked his pulse?" And her trying to intervene, and Tou Thao holding her back. And it came out this morning that he wasn't quite so sure that she was a firefighter.
Yeah, and she testified for the prosecution in this case too. Genevieve Hansen, she talked about how what she observed there is George Floyd was unable to breathe and slowing down, and then stopped talking, went unconscious, and then asked about a pulse, that she was among those that were just very emphatically, imploring them, getting pretty anxious about this, imploring them to check his pulse. That she came up and identified herself as an off-duty firefighter having medical training, and that was pretty strong testimony from her about how she felt like that Tou Thao was unresponsive to her pleas and the others here. Tou Thao then, as his defense wants him to tell his side of that encounter. He said that, yeah, she came up, but she had no identification or no clothing that would indicate she's a firefighter. That he, did you believe her? And he said, I had my suspicions, that he just wasn't convinced that this is a firefighter and that she had any, I guess, credence or authority to speak the way that she did. How that plays with the jury remains to be seen. It doesn't change what she was saying to him or the meaning of her, her pleas to him. But then it went on from there, too, to talk about her and the other people on the sidewalk that he said he was, paying attention to more than what was going on with the three officers restraining George Floyd. And he was asked, when these people were saying check his pulse and stuff, were they referring to you? And Tou Thao testified that in his mind they were saying that to the officers who were with George Floyd. I think maybe trying to absolve him of this accusation that he was unresponsive to their demands, basically testifying that in his mind those demands and those pleas were towards the other officers who were there. Also asked, did you see anybody do CPR on George Floyd? Obviously, that didn't happen, so he testified, no, I didn't. And then asked, and this is the way questioning goes, the way you have to state things in court. When you see CPR not being performed on George Floyd, then what are your conclusions from that? And he said, that tells me that he's still breathing and still has a pulse, because training is, and he testified that his training was that if they're unresponsive, not breathing, no pulse, you immediately turn them over and perform CPR. So in his mind, he testified that by not seeing that, his conclusion was George Floyd was not in medical distress.
Of course, Tou Thao on the stand today in his own defense. We are in the middle of a lunch break right now. We are expecting everyone to come back at about 2 o'clock to reconvene for the afternoon session. But Rob, I also understand that the other attorneys today let it be known to Judge Magnuson that their clients intend to testify as well in their own defense. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, and we had heard at the end of court yesterday, that was the first time that we were heard from Tou Thao and from J. Alexander King that they intended to testify in their own defense. So that was news at the very end of the day yesterday. In opening statements, Earl Gray said his client, Thomas Lane, would testify at the end of the day yesterday. They said they were unsure and had to think about that some more. This morning, informing the judge that he too will testify in his own defense. So we will hear from all three officers talking us through what they saw, what they experienced, their interpretations of what was going on, what was in their mind, why they did or didn't do things on that day. And they'll be asked too about more questions about this culture at the MPD. Did they feel that they could not intervene with somebody like Derek Chauvin? That will come up. Don't know if that will come up with Tou Thao's testimony today, since he didn't feel he was in a position to intervene because he was focused on the crowd and because he had 8 years experience versus a handful of days of the other two officers. But they'll all be able to state their mindsets here about whether they felt that was the training, that they were responding to the way they were trained, and that their training was such that they didn't feel like they could question the authority of somebody like Derek Chauvin. All
right, Rob Olson coming to us from federal court in St. Paul. The afternoon court session is getting underway at about 50 minutes from now at 2 o'clock. Rob is there. He's covering this for us. You can follow him on Twitter. And Rob, your handle is Rob Olson Fox 9. Everyone can find you there, right?
That's it. Yep. And I tried not to do play-by-play, to try to hit highlights. And today, certainly, it's more, doing a lot more today, because again, the first time we've heard Tou Thao speak, there's a lot of things to pass along as he's testifying.
All right. Thank you, my friend. And just want to let our audience know that you can find Rob's complete wrap-up tonight starting at 5 o'clock here on Fox 9. We'll have coverage throughout the night, and we invite you to join us back here every day at approximately this time, between 12:30 and 1 o'clock, depending upon when Judge Magnuson lets everyone out for their lunch break. But about, this time every day, and we'll have Rob wrap up for us everything that's been taking place in the courtroom for that morning. In the meantime, I'm Tim Blotz here at Fox 9. We'll see you later this afternoon on Fox 9. Have a great afternoon, everyone. We'll see you again here tomorrow.